Welcome to episode 2 of Let's Review All the Final Fantasies. This is the series where I play and give my thoughts on all the Final Fantasy games released thus far. I just finished playing Final Fantasy II, released in 1987 for the Famicom in Japan, and not available to North American players until the 2003 release of Final Fantasy Origins on the OG PlayStation. Now, it is important to note that there have been releases after the PlayStation. You've got the Game Boy Advance, Final Fantasy I and II, Dawn of Souls. You got the 20th anniversary release of Final Fantasy II on the PSP. There's also been releases on Steam, Android, and iOS, but I suggest you stay away from those two. I played the original cartridge on a Retron 5 with translation packs. In the past, I have reviewed Final Fantasy I for the Nintendo Entertainment System. See the link in the description or click here to see that, because I will be using Final Fantasy I as a reference point for Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II is a big departure from Final Fantasy I. I mean, sure, the graphics look very similar, and in fact, some of the sprites were even lifted directly from Final Fantasy I. But I will give Square credit for impressive use of tiled sprites and extended use of the color palettes across different sections of the screen. If you want to know more about how that works and why it's impressive, check out 8-Bit Guy's video linked in the description. Now, you no longer pick your starting characters or their classes. You're given fixed characters who no longer have fixed roles. I'll talk more about character classes, their abilities, and progression later in the video. The story is much more involved and has a stronger narrative. It's no longer a thin shell used to hold up the mechanics. FF2's story is the beginning of many Final Fantasy tropes and themes. You play as members of a small rebellion fighting against a large and unquestionably evil empire. Sound familiar? It should. This is the first time you can find and even ride chocobos. I had no idea it was this early in the series. You also meet series staple Cid for the first time. And the theme of sacrifice is very prevalent here too. Don't get too attached to any of your fourth slot characters. It was pretty cool to go back and see the starting point for a lot of the things that fans love about Final Fantasy. Now let's talk about mechanics. The mechanics of Final Fantasy II are where it all falls apart. I can appreciate that the team was really trying to do something special, innovative, and unique. I think they pushed the Famicom a little too hard here. The biggest problem is with the character growth, or leveling. See, you don't gain levels in Final Fantasy II. Instead, each character has skills and abilities that need to be leveled individually. This is a lot like systems that have come out in recent years, like the growth system of Elder Scrolls Skyrim. That sounds pretty badass, but the execution stifles any kind of enjoyment that can be had in such a system. Each skill gains in strength when a counter hits 100, meaning you used your sword 100 times, your bow 100 times, a spell 100 times. I did notice that early levels for spells meant that you only used them 50 times. That's still a lot and takes a long time to grind out progression in these skills. Now, if you want a character to gain health points, that means they have to get hit a lot, because each time your character ends a battle with less than half of their HP, there's a small chance that they'll gain more. In the early game, I was attacking my own characters in the hopes of growing their HP. Let's stop and think about this system for a moment. If you want to level your life spell, that means you have to resurrect a party member 100 times, which means allowing them to die 100 times. Now, I never did get past level 1 of the life spell, just to let you know. Now, gaining MP means using in battle. Okay, I can handle this. Maria will be my back row mage. Let's try and make her a red mage, a mix between black and white. Cool. Oh, crap. When she gains intelligence, her MPOW goes down. Intelligence governs how strong your white magic is. MPOW governs how strong your black magic is. This was the first time I noticed the big downside of the growth system. Most stats have an opposite stat, which gets weaker as the primary one grows. This meant that Maria would never be great at black or white magic. She'd just kind of be okay at both. Sometimes okay at both. The other big downside of this growth system comes later in the game. As your characters have grown proficient in certain weapon types, you stop finding new weapons for them to use. And you find some powerful weapons in other categories that no one in the party is proficient in. This meant that I was selling weapons that were supposed to be really good. Because it would take another 10 hours of playing this weak, boring system in order to train my party in this new weapons use. I just kept the ones I already had. I guess I'll keep the Nega train rolling on course here. I mentioned earlier that the story is much grander and more involved than in Final Fantasy I. That's true, but once again, poor execution ruins something that should be cool. The story requires you to return to home base after every little progression point. Even if you already know where you need to go next, you have to go back to Princess Hilda and the rebels, so she can tell you where to go. This pads out the time to complete the story a shit ton. It also makes the first 3/4 of the game really boring. You're constantly going back and forth between areas you've been to a few times. And it's not like the monsters ever get any harder. So once you don't have to worry about monsters in one area, you don't have to worry about them again until you're 3/4 of the way through the game, and there's a sudden switch to where every monster on the map is suddenly super powerful and will kill you in 2 hits. It's really irritating. About halfway through my gameplay, I started using a map on my phone to show me where the next story point is. Because most of the towns are the same looking, same sounding, and it doesn't help that the in-game map moves at 2 to 3 frames per second, and it doesn't even show you the names of the towns on it. This is fixed in later re-releases of the game, where they give you a much better map that moves at a reasonable rate. Another neat idea in this game is the keyword system. As you talk to different NPCs throughout the game, you'll see certain keywords highlighted, and you can learn these words to parrot them back at either the same NPC or others you encounter throughout your journeys. You might get good information, like strategy hints or locations on where things are. Sometimes you really do get good info this way. There are even a couple times where you use the Rebels password to prove that you're a member of the rebellion, and then someone will tell you what you need to know. The problem comes when you end up just saying every word you've ever learned to a new NPC, because the words that would make sense to use elicit the ubiquitous question mark. And the number of times you learn something new this way can be counted on one hand. Most of the time they're just repeating shit. Final Fantasy II is also the first game in the series where characters join and leave your party during the game. Now, you don't ever get to choose who your 4th party member is, but the rotating cast is a neat idea that gets reused and perfected in later games. Here, the problem comes from how weak these characters are when they join. With the exception of Min at the beginning of the game, all these 4th slot characters are severely weaker than your other members. Now, I was never overpowered during my gameplay. In fact, the game was a constant struggle to keep my party alive. But these rotating characters always required me to break from the story for a few hours to level them to the point where they weren't getting one-shotted in the first encounter after they joined. Who playtested this game and decided this was a good way to do progression? In my review of Final Fantasy I, I complained about stun locking. This is where your whole party becomes paralyzed, often by much weaker enemies, and you can't get out of it. Thus, you end up just watching your party slowly get killed. Now, I never encountered a stun lock in Final Fantasy II, but I think I grew to hate its equivalent even more than stun locking. I told you about how you must level individual stats and abilities of your characters. This includes your agility, and agility governs your ability to run away from a battle. I ended up encountering monsters who would turn 3 of my 4 characters to stone. Obviously, with them being statues, they can't run away. And I never did figure out how to level up your agility, so the one who wasn't stone couldn't run away either. So in effect, it was the same as getting stun locked, but somehow felt much cheaper. Oh, wait, I almost forgot to tell you about something even more annoying than stun locking or stone locking. It's the absolutely lousy dungeon design in this game. Here's one of the simple dungeon levels in this game. There are much worse later on. You enter from the south, follow the green path. Now you can choose from 3 branches. teal to the northwest, magenta to the northeast, or blue to the east. As you can see, blue is the only option that goes forward. Now you may see this and think to yourself, so what? I can get those treasure chests. Let me tell you, they aren't worth your time. You'll only get an eye drop and 2 potions from them. These are very common items, and with the high encounter rate of the dungeons in this game, it means you are very likely to have a net loss of HP or be blinded, which makes these items useless. You might as well push ahead and skip these treasure chests. Once you reach the end of the blue trail, you have 4 doors facing you. 3 of them are monster closets. Monster closets are rooms where once you enter them, you're dropped in the middle of the room, and every space on that floor has a 90% encounter rate. Can you guess which of these doors are monster closets? It's these 3. This was one of the simple and less maddening floors in the game. There's much, much worse throughout. Much like Final Fantasy I, 2 finished up with what I'm going to call a gauntlet run. This is a dungeon much longer than any other in the game, and it gives you no chance to rest between entering it and completing the game. It's only made longer with this game's shit design philosophy and stupefying number of monster closets. And another way to artificially add difficulty to this gauntlet run is through the inventory system of all things. Unlike in Final Fantasy I, your key items share inventory space with everything else, and nothing stacks. You're not taking 99 potions in here with you. You also carry more key items through this game than in Final Fantasy I. By the time I did this gauntlet run, literally half of my inventory space was taken up by things I couldn't sell and couldn't trash because they were important to the story one time earlier in the game. With the exception of the canoe. That thing's always useful. So you make it through the gauntlet, which is also a huge maze. You defeat the evil emperor and you bring peace back to the world. The last quarter of this game feels very rushed and sudden. It just, all of a sudden here I was, ready to kill the emperor, and it didn't feel like the rebellion had accomplished anything. The conclusion isn't satisfying in any narrative way, and your characters don't feel special or like they've grown as characters. This complaint about story progression and your characters kind of applies to Final Fantasy I as well, with the key exception being that your characters in Final Fantasy I are never presented as anything other than blank canvases for you to project your own narration onto. In fact, it's one of the things I really love about Final Fantasy I, building a new party and making up my own story on how these 4 people became the Light Warriors and found each other. In Final Fantasy II, your characters start off with a strong promise of an arc, meaning, and personalities. But those arcs never happen, their personalities never flourish or even become personalities. None of the promises that are made in the first hour of this game are ever fulfilled. If you can get past the many faults of Final Fantasy II, the story is simplistic but decent. And a simple story isn't really a negative. After all, I think the overly complicated and winding narratives of Final Fantasy VII and VIII can really prevent some players from enjoying them. In the end though, I can't recommend Final Fantasy II as a game to actually enjoy. If you want to know the story, read the synopsis on the Final Fantasy Wiki. I'm rating it as the worst game played so far. Now to be fair, that's only comparing it against one other game. In the future, when I play the other games in this series, we'll see how it stacks up. Now, if you want to ignore my advice of skipping Final Fantasy II, I did make a video comparing different versions of the game so that you can see which one might suit you best. Look in the description below, or click here. I hope you'll join me for the next entry in Let's Review All the Final Fantasies, where I'll be playing Final Fantasy Legend for the Game Boy. Thanks for watching, and as always, watch your 6. Episode 3 will probably be delayed because I kind of blew up my Retron 5, and that's how I was planning on capturing Game Boy footage. So I either have to get a new one or find a Game Boy player for the GameCube.